Hello again. With the nation clamouring for our national treasure, Captain Tom, to receive a knighthood, Downing Street confirming that it was looking at ways to recognise Tom's heroic efforts, messages of support from the royal family winging their way to his Bedfordshire home, not to mention his total raise for the NHS currently standing at over £29 million, this seems an appropriate time to talk about some female volunteers and fundraisers who stepped up to the mark, made invaluable contributions to the war effort, and raised millions of pounds. Knitting for the boys. PPE has filled the airwaves since the pandemic began. Searching questions have been asked about shortages, the EU medical equipment scheme, and why hospital stocks were so low. Apart from the many firms, large and small, who are now manufacturing these essential items, tiny endeavours are also springing up. The military co-working network, which provides hubs where military wives can, in non-lockdown days, have a workspace away from home. These have become scrub hubs, sewing scrubs for forces medics serving on the corona front line. Children can do their bit by drawing pictures and writing messages to be included with these vital scrubs. Such shortages of essential equipment in an emergency is nothing new, nor are volunteers stepping in to try to salvage a situation. If you listen to the talk about corona poetry, you might remember Lord Kitchener calling on women to do your bit, knit a stitch, and the immediate enthusiastic response. But why was knitting so vital? In the decade preceding the war, the regular army budgeted an annual supply of approximately 220,000 shirts and 1 million pairs of socks. Now, these quantities had to be found within weeks, and with more and more men flocking to enlist, demand could only increase. But where were these suppliers of such essential items? Quite simply, they were everywhere, in the nation's cottages, schools, suburban villas, manor houses, and even palaces. Knitting crossed class, age, and even gender boundaries. In rural Kent, Mrs. Billington noted how the great era of knitting set in. London teenager Mary Cools remarked, "Everybody was knitting. All our conversation was punctuated by pearl plain, pearl plain." Occasional interruptions to deal with dropped stitches made conversations problematic. Slightly reminiscent of the women of the French Revolution who continued knitting whilst watching the guillotine descend, on others' heads, not their own. During at least one trial, the judge threatened to clear the courtroom if people didn't stop knitting. Schools quickly joined this knitting craze. "Every girl who could not knit is learning to knit now," said one headmistress's report, with North London collegiate school pupils requesting the annual prize money should be spent on buying wool for the next year's knitting endeavours. Captain Tom might be pleased to know that in his native Yorkshire, 11-year-old Hilda, 9-year-old Amy, and even 3-year-old Constance Tyerman contributed 194 knitted items to their school's total of 745 warm comforts. Amy, like thousands of other children, included letters with her gifts. Great was her joy when her soldier wrote back. Often such correspondence continued, and children were heartbroken if their special soldier were killed. Maybe some of the Scrub Hub children will hear back from the superheroes they are writing letters and drawing pictures for. Hint here to superheroes. If you listen to Children at War, you might remember 12-year-old Pete Pure from Germany. Her teachers enforced discipline whilst raising money. Misdemeanours were punished by fines, which were used to buy wool. Schoolgirls knitted in class whilst being read stories of German victories. Poor Pete bewails her lack of skill in knitting the foot of the sock, and she included an apologetic letter with her offering. More talented than Pete, a French 6-year-old, Françoise Marette, felt that she was being turned into a performing monkey, with visitors being invited specifically to watch her knit. She subsequently became a world-famous child psychologist. Australian Nora Pennington relished her achievements, winning the district record for the number of socks, mufflers, mittens and balaclava helmets knitted by anyone under the age of 13. Knitting for the war effort did not bring out the best in everyone. Decades later, one of her classmates remembered, "The rest of us longed to grab her knitting, rip the stitches out and snarl her wool for her." All this knitting tried his patience. The house was always full of women clicking needles, making huge quantities of socks, vests, mittens and mufflers. Meanwhile, the elderly were equally busy knitting. A local paper included an obituary from Mrs. Lavinia Rees, who, a month short of her 90th birthday, was busily engaged knitting socks for the soldiers. The obituary is such that it almost sounds as though the poor lady had expired, needles in hand. Knitting wasn't only happening in courtrooms, on buses and in classrooms. Owners of stately homes set up working parties for their tenants' wives, whilst Queen Mary had balls of wool and needles strategically placed around Buckingham Palace, and she herself took up her needles. In some areas, a little bit like the Sandhurst scrubs being made for army medics, knitters knitted for their local troops. By early December 1914, one Buckinghamshire working party had sent 955 garments to hospitals treating Bucks boys, whilst in Dundee, 6,000 pairs of socks were knitted for Scottish regiments by Christmas 1914. As not all would-be knitters could afford to buy wool, those unable to knit donated money to purchase wool. Although fun has been unjustly poked at this knitting army and at its truly staggering output, serving men and women urged their families to encourage knitters to greater efforts. Their letters emphasised the desperate ongoing need for socks. In November 1914, writing from No. 5 Casualty Clearing Station in France, Army nurse Genty Patterson, whose letters and diaries resonate with the horrors of war, begged those at home to continue, explaining how, sometimes moulded to their limbs, soldiers' socks have generally been on 5, 6, 7 weeks. Frostbitten feet could lead to amputation. As they battle to keep patients' feet warm in the frequently tented hospitals overseas, or on the inadequately heated hospital trains and hospital barges, which I told you about in We've Nursed Like This Before, most nursing staff would have agreed that soldiers' feet depended, quite literally, upon home front knitters. In November 1915, Genty used some of her precious leave to give a fundraising lantern lecture. The subject, soldiers' socks, or lack thereof. Canadian sister Agnes Warner also pleaded for socks. So many of the men have just straw in their boots and are almost frozen. Donors often like to know how their money is being spent. For example, we know some of Captain Tom's millions are being used for NHS workers. Agnes's knitters learned their socks were dispatched to the dressing stations by ambulance, and from there they go to the trenches at once. If you listen to the poetry talk, you might remember the Fannies. One Fanny, Pat Beecham, took knitted comforts to entrenched Belgian troops. Devastated that her supply of socks and scarves was insufficient to go round the men who so desperately needed them. Some had not had clean socks in 3 months, beating Genty's 7 weeks. Pat donated her own scarf, and then could only turn sorrowfully away and beg those at home to keep up, even increase their efforts. Once America entered the war, Red Cross posters shrieked at civilians, "Our boys need socks." Like all Red Cross organisations, the American one provided knitters with patterns, wool if necessary, and shipped the items overseas. American troops were calculated as needing 1.5 million each of knitted wristlets, mufflers, sweaters, and pairs of socks, although, due to the nature of trench warfare, socks were, as for all other soldiers, paramount. The New York Sunday Sun ran competitions for poems about knitting. The prizes? Balls of wool. If the subsequent published volume is representative, the competitors were numerous, and the number of socks they knitted must have equipped many a battalion. Whilst knitting provided a way of sending both love and essential items to the troop, there are also spy stories associated with knitting, but that is a story for another day. Part 2. Kicking a ball around. On the 6th of April 2020, 99-year-old Captain Tom Moore set himself the challenge of walking 100 laps of his garden before his forthcoming 100th birthday, aiming to raise £1,000 for the NHS. On the 16th of April, 2 weeks before the target day, flanked by a socially distanced Guard of Honour formed by men of the 1st Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment, Tom completed his challenge, and with the NHS then £12 million better off, Tom marched into the COVID-19 history books. Whilst Captain Tom's walking challenge was, and remains, the COVID-19 feel-good factor, some sporting events and sports have been in the firing line. Football has definitely hit the headlines. On the 12th of March, well over 50,000 people, including 3,000 fans from Madrid, gathered to watch the Liverpool Atletico match. Questions have since been asked as to whether this fixture should have taken place. Footballers have been called out for not taking a pay cut. In response, Chelsea players have been instructed to continue to support charities, including the NHS. These points got me thinking about the beautiful game as played by women munition workers in the Great War, and more specifically, their fundraising endeavours. The story of the most successful football players really begins in Preston in 1913, when 21-year-old Grace Bamber married Jimmy Sibbott. By 1916, Private Sibbott was a POW in Germany. With German civilians facing starvation, unsurprisingly, those in prisoner of war camps were low on the list for rations, and conditions, particularly for enlisted soldiers, were brutal. Young and old, rich and poor, flung themselves into raising money, often for their local men being held as POWs. The Hull and East Riding Prisoners of War Fund raised a total of today's equivalent of £100,000 and sent 131,341 parcels to prisoners of war. The teachers and girls of Lancaster Girls' Grammar School fundraising sales of work and concerts held in 1917 raised around £3,500 in today's money. Grace, now employed at Preston's Dick Kerr's munitions factory, had thrown her considerable energies both into raising money for POW charities and, more significantly in terms of football history, into helping to create the Dick Kerr ladies football team. At Dick Kerr's, footy practice included shooting at the cloakroom windows. Munitions factories and their employees were seen as potential fundraisers. "Now England needs more money, so has called on us once more," wrote one munitions worker amateur poet in her factory magazine. Ladies' sporting events in aid of war charities had been blossoming throughout 1917. Now, football and fundraising were about to collide. In January 1915, a Red Cross War Hospital opened on Moor Park in Preston. It was one of over 100 such establishments in Lancashire alone. Housed in pavilions, the hospital depended on the local community for all but the barest of essentials. Concerts and other entertainments were a favoured form of fundraising, and some weeks before Christmas 1917, Moor Park's matron contacted Dick Kerr, asking if munition workers could put on a fundraising concert. Grace had an alternative idea. In late November, a notice appeared. Dick Kerr ladies' football team had challenged the women of another Lancashire factory, Arundel Coulthard Foundry, to a great Christmas Day attraction. The venue, Preston North Football Club's home ground, Deepdale. The beneficiaries, Moor Park. For a later rescinded fee of £5, about £412 today, the club shouldered the responsibility of advertising the match via posters. Did Grace ever imagine that on Christmas Day 1917, 10,000 people would flock through the gates? Initially not quite sure what they were expecting, the crowd soon began enjoying the players' prowess. Snide comments about who was the tastiest player, which were made as had happened at a ladies' match in Chelmsford, went unreported. When the final whistle blew, the home team had run a resounding 4-0 victory. After settling the not inconsiderable costs, about which there were some adverse comments, reminiscent perhaps of the comments floating around the internet on the Just Giving fee levied on donations to Captain Tom, Dick Care's ladies donated the equivalent of £49,500 to Moor Park. This was the opening salvo, not only of Dick Care ladies' phenomenal success as fundraisers, but also as the premier women's team in the land. Long after the guns fell silent, they continued their fundraising endeavours, initially in aid of veterans' charities, even playing in the first international football match. Their demise, through the machinations of a misogynistic FA, is a story for my forthcoming book, Changing Roles: Women in the Aftermath of the Great War. Part 3. Singing Our Way to Victory. On the 24th of April 2020, accompanying Michael Ball, Captain Tom became the oldest person to reach the top of the pops. You'll Never Walk Alone recorded 82,000 sales for NHS charities together. Music often strikes a chord in time of crisis. Music and song brought emotional comfort to millions throughout the Great War. Whilst those at home also used concerts to provide entertainment and raise funds, professional artists were bringing what we might now call music therapy to those serving overseas, both in hospitals and close to the front line. In 1914, well-known actress Lena Ashwell had a brainwave. She would use her skills as both an actor and an impresario to entertain the troops. Eventually, the rather straight-laced, definitely sceptical YMCA, who provided canteens and rest clubs for the troops, agreed to give the idea a trial run, but declined to fund it. Having raised sufficient funds to get the show on the road, in early 1915, the very first of those whom Lena dubbed modern troubadours docked in Boulogne. They were about to sing their way into history. At first, the army bigwigs who had to give permission for performances to go ahead were doubtful. They were worried, as 19-year-old Elsie Griffin remembered, that the artistes might arrive in tights with peroxided hair. The girls were even locked into a caravan at night. Elsie doesn't specify for whose protection this was. This trial concert proved an overwhelming success, and the Lena Ashwell's concert parties for troops were born, and with them an endless round of fundraising. Although the War Office did give Lena the green light, the parties had to be self-funding. For Lena, only the best was good enough for the boys. Those whom she recruited as troubadours were often leading lights of the London stage, or those for whom, with her well-tuned talent-spotting skills, she foresaw glittering careers. To the troops' amazement, these artistes were prepared to brave knee-deep mud, candlelit huts, barns or tents, and for 2 hours sing us the songs of our own land. It was immediately obvious that concert parties really did contribute to troop welfare and morale. Some men began to consider that, other than a wound serious enough to get them sent back to England, a Lena Ashwell concert party was the best thing that could happen to them. Troubadours performed in hospitals where, for a short while, they lightened the atmosphere impregnated with pain and concentrated suffering for patients, nurses, and doctors. On more than one occasion, a soldier died peacefully with a violinist playing at his bedside. Concerts took place whatever the weather. Lena knew that the sight of our girls is the very salt of life to these poor, pain-racked men. Soon, parties were travelling to distant theatres of war, Malta with its 20,000 hospital beds, Palestine and Egypt. In Cairo, audiences regularly exceeded 6,000 and the temperatures 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Poet Siegfried Sassoon, listening spellbound in the desert, captured the mood of the audience. We hear them, drink them, till the concert's done. If You'll Never Walk Alone will be undoubtedly remembered as the COVID-19 song. One song, more than any other, has seared itself into our collective memory of the First World War. Lena Ashwell was its midwife. At one of the early concert parties, a young troubadour took to the makeshift stage. Had there been a wartime top of the pops chart, his song would have had as meteoric a rise through the charts as Captain Tom. The troubadour's name? Ivor Novello. The song, Keep the Home Fires Burning.
Keep the home fires burning while your hearts are yearning. Though your lands are far away, they dream of home. There's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining, and the dark cloud inside out till the boys come home.
When he sang it, the men seemed to drink it in at once and instantly sang the chorus. And, as we drove away at the end of the concert in the dark and the rain and the mud, from all parts of the camp one could hear the refrain, Keep the home fires burning. Costs rose inexorably, for although some artists could donate their time, others could not. Lena resisted all attempts to charge even a small entrance fee. To her, each note sung was a loving gift from home. Not unlike socks being knitted for local boys, towns often raise money to send a party consisting of local artists to their boys, who longed to hear songs from their areas sung in their local accents, far more noticeable then than now. Although Captain Tom's fundraising does put Lena's in the shade, although not meaning to sound churlish, he does have the power of the internet behind him, she was pretty adept. Her most adventurous and lucrative event occurred in early December 1917 at the Royal Albert Hall. Tickets for what she dubbed a Petticoat Lane tombola cost the equivalent of £20 today, and a truly impressive array of the equivalent of £440,000 worth of prizes were donated, including 2 acres of land on the Chiltern Hills, complete with the then equivalent of planning permission, a grand piano, a diamond necklace, a porcelain bathroom, but, surprisingly, the prize which excited the most interest was a prize pedigree bull, which Prime Minister Herbert Asquith's wife insisted on solemnly parading around the hall. So many tickets had been sold that they had to be mixed by Boy Scouts in a beer barrel lent by a brewery to make sure the contents were thoroughly mixed. The tombola raised the staggering equivalent of £2,706,400. Now the show could go on. One soldier assured Lena, who post-war was awarded an OBE, that her modern troubadours were the fairy godmother of us all. Part 4. Raising extraordinary sums. Captain Tom now holds the Guinness Book of Records record for the amounts he has raised. One young woman who could give him a bit of a run for his money's story starts in August 1914, when Dr. Elsie Ingalls, a widely respected Scottish surgeon and committed campaigner for women's suffrage, offered her services to the Royal Army Medical Corps. Their response? Good lady, go home and sit still. Talented though she was, sitting still was not in the furious Elsie's skill set. she decided she would do the opposite. She persuaded the Edinburgh branch of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, of which, conveniently, she was president, to form and finance what would become the Scottish Women's Hospital Units for Foreign Service, shortened to SWH. They served with Britain's allies with gallantry and distinction throughout the war. The mayor of Constanza, Romania's largest port, commented, after seeing the SWH providing medical services to Romanian soldiers, "No wonder Britain is such a great country if her women are like that." He should have added the adjective generous, for fundraising never ceased. Flag Days never brought in enough money, and so a small army of speakers was recruited to offer talks, illustrated by the popular lantern slide shows, with plenty of opportunities for donations. In mid-May 1915, Elsie Ingall's eye fell upon a young secretary who, having returned from a spell working in France, was now in the London office. With Ingall's deaf to Catherine's assertion that she did not much fancy a public speaking engagement, she was neither the first nor the last woman to find herself unable to refuse Elsie Ingall's. Kathleen discovered she had a natural talent and was soon covering the country, eloquently pleading the SWH cause and its never-ending need for funds to enable it to continue its life-saving work. From June 1915, her name is constantly in local British newspapers. She is billed as having just returned from the front, talking charmingly, always reminding attendees that the hospitals were funded entirely by voluntary contributions. Soon, the SWH's most valuable non-medical asset, in December 1915, the fundraising committee took a huge gamble and dispatched her on a 3-month, 10,000-mile tour of North America. Like Captain Tom, she soon dwarfed her initial target of today's equivalent of £106,000. Kathleen captivated transatlantic audiences just as she had the home ones. She was the first woman ever invited to speak on the New York Stock Exchange, raising £212,000 equivalent from her one speech. By July 1916, the SWH were, in today's terms, £1,127,000 the richer. Her spectacular success led to American and Canadian newspapers dubbing her the $1,000 a day girl who had recently returned from the battlefront. Pleading for audience sympathy, she frequently commented that she found public speaking more daunting than shells, of which, as she explained to her spellbound audiences, she had experience, and was about to get more. Finally back in England with barely time to unpack, Kathleen was off again. She was the first Englishwoman to enter Verdun, which she called a white city of desolation, where over 200,000 French and German soldiers lost their lives or were severely wounded between the 21st of February and mid-July 1916. She even managed to squeeze in writing a book about her experiences with proceeds to the SWH, whose well-oiled press-cutting agency made sure that her white road to Verdun and her meetings with Generals Nivelle, Pétain and Joffre attracted massive press interest on both sides of the Atlantic. Comments such as "a mere slip of a girl, Miss Burke stood calmly by the side of officers at Verdun while big shells were dropping about," helped raise the equivalent of nearly £23 million in America alone. Accolades and honours, as well as money, flooded in. Gazetted honorary colonel of the 138th US Field Artillery, Kathleen received the British CBE, the Serbian Knight of St. Saviour, and the French Chevalier of the Légion d'Honneur. More importantly, the shy young woman who told the SWH committee that she did not possess the necessary skills to undertake that 1915 speaking engagement, earned the highest praise that Dr. Elsie Ingalls could bestow on any member of her staff. "Dear girl, I knew you could do it." Part 5. Why not VCs for women? According to press reports, Captain Tom's multiple messages of praise include ones from members of the royal family, from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and celebs. So, let me finish this week with this week's talk with Dr. Elsie Ingalls, who was similarly recognised eventually, and also flesh out the story of her SWH. Like Corona, which knows no geographical boundaries, the Great War covered multiple theatres and fronts. Although SWH units served on many fronts, their service on the Balkan and Russian ones was arguably the most remarkable. Female ambulance drivers set off across shell-cratered terrain to bring in the wounded, sometimes having to pull their ambulances in order to do so. Female surgeons performed intricate surgery in the most challenging conditions. Despite being in her 50s, radiographer Edith Stoney repaired electric wires sitting astride ridge tents in a howling gale. And the upper-class young ladies cleaned out cesspits with a will. They made soup with untreated water from the Danube, commenting that it made a lovely-looking, rich, brown broth. Silence reigns about its taste. SWH volunteers travelled alone across hundreds of miles of war-torn country to brave the perils of crowded troop trains and desperate peasantry, and faced the continuous possibility of enemy fire. Placing their own lives at risk, they were imprisoned rather than abandon those in their care to the incoming enemy. One and all, they were motivated by Ingalls' boundless, contagious belief in the ability of British womanhood to perform the impossible, as Russian-speaking Cambridge graduate Elsie Butler discovered. By 1917, Russia was in revolutionary turmoil. The British government had decided to recall all medical units serving there. Still smarting from the refusal of her 1914 offer of service, Elsie Ingalls was in no mood to be ordered around. Knowing that her volunteers included some MP and other influential men's daughters, she hatched a plan. Having developed a deep affection for the Serb soldiers who were now being massacred on the Russian front, she offered terms to the War Office. The unit and MP's daughters would return, but only if the Serbs were evacuated with them. Knowing that Elsie meant every word that she said, diplomatic and military strings were pulled. Finally, in late October 1917, the unit began a race of well over 1,000 miles against time, the weather, and the Russian Revolution. They reached Archangel on the 9th of November 1917, days before ice closed the port for months. With Russia in total chaos, Trotsky had called a national general strike. All work of any kind was prohibited. Penalties for those who broke ranks, severe. Trotsky had not anticipated having to deal with the SWH. Ingalls detailed Elsie Butler to ensure that their 40 tons of donated equipment was safely loaded aboard their ship to be transported back home. When Elsie Butler reported the political situation, Ingalls' response was brief and to the point. You either get the equipment on board before we sail, or you stay behind to guard it. Your duty is to the equipment. Caught, as she herself expressed it, between the irresistible force of Ingalls' will and the immovable obstacle of a revolution-inspired national strike, Butler wondered which would be easier, change Ingalls' mind, break the strike. She settled for the latter. Every last item of equipment was loaded on board. Butler laconically commented that, I held up the Russian Revolution for 24 hours. The rigours of a journey over the treacherous Arctic Ocean now faced the women. 4 days after leaving Archangel, they became separated from their convoy, their captain unable to pinpoint their whereabouts to within 100 miles. One woman recorded in her diary, I nearly went mad in the night. I am not a coward really, but this continual strain is terrible. Many of these women had been away on the Eastern Front for years, close to or even in the firing line. They had withstood the horrors of retreat and advance. They had covered hundreds of miles in troop trains, ox carts, rickety ambulances, and on foot. They had tended mutilated bodies, nursed the dying, and buried the dead. their own included. Finally, they had travelled through a country torn apart by brutal revolution. Many believed it was only Ingall's extraordinary willpower which brought them safely through the fury of Arctic storms and the ever-present danger of submarines. On the 25th of November 1917, the Scottish women of the Russia unit sailed up the Tyne. In uniform and wearing her many Russian and Serb decorations, War Surgeon Dr. Elsie Ingall stood on deck to take the salute of the 13,000 Serb soldiers she had helped rescue from Russia. Drafted into the remnants of the First Serb Army, they fought their way back to their homeland, their breakthrough in September 1918 leading to the collapse of Bulgaria, a key factor in persuading the German High Command to sue for peace. In 2015, the Serbian Postal Service acknowledged its debt to Elsie and the British women by issuing a series of beautiful stamps depicting those women who a century ago, when their own medical services had been overwhelmed, had rushed to Serbia's aid. And there's even a parallel with Captain Tom. All stamped post up until Friday the 30th of April 2020 will be marked with Happy 100th Birthday Captain Thomas Moore, NHS Fundraising Hero, 30th of April 2020. Elsie, however, had but 24 hours to live after taking that salute. When the news of her untimely death broke, Queen Mary's personal letter to Ingall's sister headed the list of dignitaries who expressed admiration for her life and condoled with her family. Journalists rushed to publish obituaries, leading articles and assessments of her life. At Ingall's military funeral, newspaper photographers fought to gain the best shots as a small coffin placed on a gun carriage and covered by the Union flag began her final journey to the Dean Cemetery, burial ground of Scotland's heroes. Reflecting on Ingall's life, her achievements, her leadership of the SWH and its 14 units, all funded by voluntary donations, the Daily Sketch was far from alone in asking, why not VCs for women? The thread that has run through this talk, which has encompassed the very young and the very old who donated their labour through knitting for the boys, the working class factory girls who gave up hard-earned leisure time to play footy matches to benefit their local war hospitals and war charities, the artistes who eased the dying and comforted the living by singing them the songs of their own land, the army of volunteer fundraisers, and those who donated to the work of the SWH in countries they may never even have heard of. That thread is the generosity of humankind. It is this generosity that Captain Tom Moore perhaps unwittingly tapped into when he began his epic 100 laps walk, setting himself what at the time may have seemed an ambitious target, raising £1,000 for the NHS. Thank you, Captain Tom Moore, and thank you to that army of volunteers. And thank you for listening.